Hello and welcome to another episode of Roz's Random Ramblings. My name is Roz and I'm your rambler for the day. As always, I will be answering a question. This episode, it's another genealogy one asking who are my ancestors, only this time it's not about my brother-in-law Randy, but my nephew's wife, Sierra. I mentioned last time that she has a lot of Métis ancestry and I had planned to do stories on a couple of them, but then I ran into a glitch in the history matrix, which is why this episode is also late. I wanted to do justice to their stories, especially since I discovered a lot of misinformation online and several other people looking for the same answers I was. So I decided to set that aside for further research and switch gears to talk instead about some of Sierra's European ancestors who were among the settlers at Jamestown. I assure you, the Métis stories are still on their way. In this episode, however, I'm going to explore a little bit about the Burrows family of Virginia. Before I get to the history stories, wacky little aside. Names of early settlers are often interesting, and Sierra's family tree has plenty of them. I was pretty stoked to see Casper Springsteen on the list, as being related to Bruce would be super cool. No evidence of that yet. Or how about an honest-to-goodness Bond character, Margarita Moneypenny? Of course, we are never told what Miss Moneypenny's first name is in most of the Bond films, but are you like me and thought Moneypenny had to be a fake name? Well, it isn't. The family tree also contains the requisite Puritan names that come from virtues, my favorite being Preserved Strong. How do you shorten that to a nickname? Prez? Zerved? I'm guessing with a name like that, no one shortened it. By the way, his mom's name was Freedom. Married name? Freedom Strong. Now that is an American name if ever I heard one. Freedom had 3 siblings, whose names were Experience, Thankful, and John. Kinda petered out on the last one. But if none of those made you chuckle or smile, then I have one more for you. Margaret Strangepig.
You're kidding.
I'm not making this up. Strange is a well-known surname in the US, but it's not often combined with the family name Pig. The only way that name could get more awkward would be if her first name had been Ima. Tomfoolery over and done with, back to the Burrows family. The first thing I need to say is that one of the biggest problems with doing genealogy, particularly for Europeans migrating to the Americas, is the name changes. Sierra's 12th great-grandfather was a man named Anthony Burrows, and I found 5 different spellings for his family name alone. For each name you find, you have to first of all check to ensure that it is, in fact, the same person you've been looking for, and second, that the entry has any useful information on the person. Also, people have an annoying habit of naming their offspring after themselves, mostly men, which can lead to some confusion that takes a minute to untangle. In fact, Anthony Burrows' father was named, you guessed it, Anthony Burrows. Honestly, if it weren't for the fact that I really enjoy learning about world history through the more common individuals who lived it, rather than leaders in wars, I'd check the whole thing out the window and go bake a cake. Oh, I have been craving coconut cake for a while now, and even bought the coconut to make it. But I digress again. On with the Burrows family. Anthony Burrows arrived in Jamestown in April 1617, a full decade after it had actually been established. For historical context, this was 1 month after Pocahontas died in England, having been there for nearly a year with her husband, John Rolfe, and their son, Thomas. I mention this not only for historical context, but because the Rolfe family had gone to England to promote investment and settlement in the New World, including Jamestown. It's possible that the Rolfes' visit spurred Anthony to take the plunge into North America, but chances are he'd already been thinking about it for a while. That's because his father, Anthony Sr., and his brother and sister, John and Anne, were already there. In fact, they had been among the earliest colonists. Anne actually gets the most historical attention of the bunch in history books, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To be clear, the Burrows family were not on the first ships to Jamestown. Those ships were the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, which landed on April 26, 1607, and contained exclusively men, John Smith and John Ratcliffe among them. The ships contained about 104 settlers and supplies that were intended to get them started. You can find documents online that show who sailed on what vessels, including when they were born and died, and something that strikes you awfully quickly is how terribly many died within the first few months of arrival. Of the 104 initial settlers to land in Jamestown on those 3 ships, only about 40 were still alive a year later. What happened? Disease? Attacks by indigenous people? Yes, but there was an even deadlier enemy. Jamestown suffered from the same problem that had led to the lost colony at Roanoke 2 decades earlier, a lack of supplies, meaning many of those men starved to death. Fortunately, England had learned something from Roanoke. They were going to have to show up with a lot more supplies, lickety-split, if they were going to make this America thing work. Even as those men were struggling in Jamestown, supply ships were being loaded in England, and the first group of relief vessels headed to Jamestown in October of 1607. They also brought more settlers with them, all male, and each with specific skill sets that were hoped to help the colony survive. The second supply ship, the Mary and Margaret, set sail in August of 1608, and in addition to the requisite supplies and mob of men hungry for adventure, this ship contained something truly unique: English women. Woo! Woo! 2 of them, to be exact. The first being Mistress Margaret Fox Forrest, who came with her wealthy husband Thomas Forrest, and Anne Burrows, who was Mistress Forrest's maid, making Anne the first single Englishwoman to arrive in Jamestown. She's also notable for being the bride in the first English wedding in Jamestown. Fun fact! How did Anne Burrows meet her husband, John Leyden, fall in love, and get married? Lots of different stories appear online. John Leyden was a carpenter, and the Forrests were fairly wealthy, so a reasonable assumption is that Anne and John met when he was doing some construction work for the Forrests, but that's a best guess. What we can tell from actual historical records is that Anne was 14 and John about 26 when they married. The ceremony took place sometime in December of 1608, and Anne's ship arrived October 1st, so they had about 2.5 months from when she arrived to when they married. Seems kind of fast, but considering how quickly people were dying off, maybe that was to be expected. The records also show that they were married in the only church on the settlement, which we know in part because history books often distinguish it as the same church where John Rolfe and Pocahontas would be married nearly 5 years later. Talk about having your wedding upstaged. But all of this is incidental to our main guy, who I stopped talking about a while back because, like so many actual historians before me, I was distracted by the story about his sister Anne. However, Anne is Sierra's 12th great-aunt. We're interested in her 12th great-grandfather, Anthony Burrows. As I mentioned before, Anthony arrived about a decade after Jamestown was settled. Before he arrived, the first 3 or 4 years at the colony had seen 3 major periods of starvation, which the Burrows family that was already there survived. John Rolfe had become successful with growing tobacco, leading others to do the same, and his marriage to Pocahontas helped create a short-lived period of peace with the Powhatan Confederacy. This allowed the settlers time to adapt by embracing local food crops, including corn, beans, and squash, while they continued trying to establish crops from Europe. Few women arrived in that first 10 years, but they really started moving to Jamestown around the same time that Anthony went with his wife, Joanne Daughtry, and their daughter, Ellen Burrows. Fun fact! The men of Jamestown had anxiously awaited the influx of available Englishwomen for more reasons than just the most obvious. Although, I think the obvious should be acknowledged because one of the restrictions put on all those men who were arriving and dying in the colonies was that they weren't allowed to romantically intermingle with the indigenous women. What? In that sense, John Rolfe really broke the rules, though he was able to justify it by claiming that it was good for the colony, which it was for a while. But the English women were also useful for cooking and cleaning and making the little hovels in which many of them started out into little homes, thus encouraging men to stay when they might otherwise have given up and gone home. This was in stark contrast to the French settlers in Canada, who would regularly take indigenous common-law wives to help them survive the first few years. Mind you, another oft-overlooked essential that the Englishwomen brought was the knowledge of how to brew beer, which was deemed indispensable in colonial times. We consider this a male-dominated industry today, but women were the original brewers, and they were the ones who had to adapt to the local food sources available for brewing. However, that's fodder for another episode. Back to Jamestown and the Burrows. Most men who arrived in the colonies had listed occupations, but neither the senior nor the junior Anthony Burrows gave one. The younger Anthony's record indicated only that he was a gentleman, which seems to suggest that he was fairly wealthy, and he soon became associated with landholdings around the area that is today called Newport News. There, he grew tobacco, as did his nearest neighbors, brother-in-law John Leyden, and soon-to-be in-laws, the Harris family. Yes, Anthony's one and only daughter, Ellen, who had accompanied her parents to the Americas, married into the Harris family, eventually inheriting her father's estate, which was absorbed into that of the Harrises. William and Ellen Harris were Sierra's 11th great-grandparents and played a significant symbolic role in the early colonial years, as their marriage marked an important shift in the economy. Although the Burrows, Ladens, and Harrises were not among the most affluent of the colony, the substantial rise in prosperity their union produced embodied the transition from a struggling and unstable settlement to an established colony that could actually thrive. The colonists were finally flourishing, introducing new foods and products to Europe, acquiring more property, and gradually developing into a kind of landed gentry. For better or worse, the colony had arrived. Lengthy diversion. I wanted to include another Burrows family story I found, but it was tricky to fit into the main part, so I'm giving it its own spot. It turns out that while Anne Burrows Layden had overshadowed the rest of her family in the historical record by virtue of being the first English bride in the Americas, her brother John, Sierra's 12th great-uncle who came to America with Anne in 1608, had his own crazy place in history. Only, in his case, it wasn't a pleasant event. It was murder. To find out what happened, we need to take a look at the less pleasant side of colonial life. Like starvation is the pleasant side. But I mean indentured servants. These were people who, unlike the ones we've been discussing so far, wanted to come to North America in hopes of getting rich, but didn't have special trades or, more importantly, money. These people would sell themselves as indentured servants, meaning that the purchaser would pay for their passage and their room and board while in the colonies, and the servant would perform whatever duties were required. Mostly, these duties were field work, toiling in the tobacco fields that made other men, including the ones I've been discussing so far, a lot of money. Mind you, some might have worked in or around the house, so they may have had a nicer time of it. More importantly, all indentured servants had a foreseeable end to their work. An indentured servant's contract would usually last for 4 to 7 years, longer if the servant was a child or convict, and after the term was up, the servant was supposed to receive some tools and a small tract of land on which to build up their own fortunes, just as the Burrows, Harrises, and Ladens had done. Pretty good deal, right? Except... Indentured servants were not servants in the way they had been in Europe. They were not like Anne Burrows being a maid to Mistress Forrest. They were slaves, and the way many of them were treated was a precursor to how African slaves would be treated when they became ubiquitous decades later. I found one particular case of 2 indentured servants, a young woman named Elizabeth Abbott and a young man named Elias Hinton, both murdered in 1624, beaten to death, directly or indirectly, by their masters, John and Alice Proctor. The judgment? Acquittal. John Proctor, who had beaten Elias Hinton with a rake, claimed self-defense, but if you read what's left of the trial transcripts, there is no mention of needing to defend himself. Instead, John regularly complained that Hinton, by all accounts a weak and sickly man, was stubborn, and Proctor would often smack Elias upside the head, or worse, for not working hard enough. Nevertheless, John Proctor was acquitted. Elizabeth Abbott, meanwhile, had been beaten numerous times, almost always for running away every time they beat her. This was clearly never going to end well for Elizabeth. But of course, Alice Proctor was also acquitted because of what online sources vaguely call a technicality regarding servant correction laws of the time. Basically, the court said that, although the Proctors had beaten Elizabeth until virtually every inch of her was bruised and her body was riddled with lacerations, conservative estimates put her lashings the last time at well over 100, her death had been an unforeseeable accident of regular discipline. Poor Alice Proctor, made to go on trial for something that clearly wasn't her fault. If only Elizabeth Abbott could have taken a beating, or 100. You may recall that I mentioned John Burrows was involved in a murder case, and this wasn't the one I meant, though he actually did testify in John and Alice Proctor's trial for manslaughter against them. Burrows testified that, following one tremendously bad beating, after which Elizabeth Abbott again ran away, she went to see John Burrows, a neighbor, and showed him how severely she'd been beaten. He seems to have been a decent person who was alarmed enough by her injuries to go to the Proctors and tell them that, if they continued beating Elizabeth in this way, they would surely kill her. They listened carefully, took Elizabeth back in, and immediately beat her. Ironically, 4 years later, John Burrows was involved in another murder that dealt with an indentured servant, though he never made it to the trial because this time he was the victim. The circumstances behind John Burrows' murder are pretty clear thanks to trial records from the case. The murderer, William Reed, was practically a boy, about 14 years old, though in colonial times that was old enough to get married, so I guess not that young for them. The whole incident boils down to a disagreement over a knife, which, if you're going to have a disagreement, that's a bad thing for it to be about. According to court records, which are super difficult to read because they say things like, John Gay, servant to Benjamin Jackson, sworn and examined, saith that on New Year's Day last, past about 2 or 3 of the clock in the afternoon, this examiate being mending of a pint pot that was melted, well, you get the idea. But apparently, a servant in Benjamin Jackson's household, John Gay, was fixing a pot when both John Burrows and William Reed decided to sit down and watch, John Burrows offering to help. John Gay asked to borrow William Reed's knife, but Reed appears to have been a rather obstinate young man as he immediately said no, so Gay just took the knife, and Burrow called Reed a rogue for not freely lending it. Reed then called Gay a thief, so Burrow dropped his own knife and punched Reed in the chest. This was apparently too much for Reed, who picked up Burrow's own knife and stabbed him with it. Reed at one point tried to claim Burrow accidentally ran onto the knife.
Oops.
Apparently, though, no one believed him, as Reed went on trial a year later, and because he wasn't a wealthy landowner like the Proctors, he was found guilty of manslaughter. He was a clever lad, though, or at least well-informed, so when asked what he had to say for himself, he did something called pleading benefit of clergy, which was originally intended to protect clergy from prosecution for a first offense, but had become watered down to the point that anyone who could recite a scripture verse could plead benefit of clergy. William Reed was likely branded on the thumb to show that he pled clergy, a permanent mark in case he tried to make the same claim elsewhere, and was sent back to work in Benjamin Jackson's household where the entire incident had taken place. Weighty aside, what happened to William Reed after the verdict? No one knows. He disappears from the record, which is actually pretty common for a lot of the indentured servants who came to North America in the early years of settlement. A substantial percentage, anywhere from 40 to 80%, are assumed to have died either of disease, starvation, skirmishes, or maltreatment before they were ever released from their contracts. And as with so many slaves in the following decades, few if any records of their deaths exist. Of those who did survive, only some of them got the benefits they'd initially been promised. No record exists of William Reed owning land, so either he never received it or died before he was released from his contract. Many indentured servants denied their promised land were forced to go out and fend for themselves, which was tough to do when they had few skills other than farm work and had to compete for those jobs with newer indentured servants. And there were always plenty of those. Historians estimate that out of the more than 500,000 people who migrated from Europe to the US before the Revolutionary War, at least half and as many as 2/3 were indentured servants. And the indentured servant system carried on, in one form or another, into the early 20th century. What a mess! Just like today, the rich get richer and the poor sit around making podcasts. Oh boy. So now we come to the answering the question part of the episode. Who were Sierra's ancestors? At least one group of them represented the resilience that led to the European settlement of North America. Her ancestors survived famine and the great unknown, gradually adapted to a world that was utterly strange to them, and built new lives and relationships there that they likely couldn't have had in England. In this new world, a carpenter and a maid could work their way up to landowners of some substance, and people married, raised families, lived full lives, and created a new identity for themselves. That sort of upward mobility through hard work is what the American dream is supposed to be, and it did exist at one time, though not for everyone. We can't forget that this hard work was often done by people who never had the chance to get ahead, who died trying. There is rarely such a thing as a truly self-made person. Well, hopefully that episode was entertaining and informative. I love Puritan names. If I find anything interesting about Preserved Strong, I'll make another episode just about him. For now, though, I decided to switch to a linguistic topic. Next episode, I'll be answering the question, what does ironic mean? Stay tuned for that. This has been another episode of Roz's Random Ramblings. All of the research, writing, and production are done by me, Roz Hirsch, because it's better than filling out paperwork all day. Special thanks to Stephen Spicer for once again providing the voice of grumpy old men.
What?
You know why. The only thing that isn't done by me is the recording of music, so here's where I got that stuff. The intro song was called Ragtime Cocktail Bar Music by Alex Morgan, which I downloaded from the website pixabay.com. The remaining music comes from the website epidemicsound.com and includes the following: Happiest Camper on Earth by Stationary Sign, Fields by Franz Gordon, Spring Romance by Hannah Ekstrom, Running to Recess by American Legion, Tumbleweed by Roots and Recognition, Oleka by Franz Gordon, Mysterious Forest by Howard Harper Barnes, and Ascent by Martin Land. I try to upload episodes every Monday at noon Mountain Daylight Time. Today's was a day late, but I still got it out there eventually, so keep checking. And as always, thanks for listening.